These are the very same processes which created the environment sustaining life for more than 3 billion years. Scientific evidence tells us that these are the most effective tools for meeting the challenge of the biodiversity collapse and climate turbulence we are now experiencing. Climate change, as we can see with our own eyes, is not a future event. It is now. In each of these 2-hour international conversations on a Saturday morning, the question is always, how can we harness these natural solutions to effective climate policies? We began in June with 2 soil and food production experts in Australia and India, and a US Congresswoman who is also an organic farmer. In September, we shifted focus from soil to the animals living on the soil and their role in shaping the ecosystems we all depend on. Today, with the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland, just concluded a week ago, what else could we talk about? So we have titled this chapter of our series, Code Red in Glasgow, What Did They Miss? We welcome 3 people to this conversation. Professor Joseph Michael Hunt will be speaking to us today from Dorchester, Massachusetts. Dee Woods, representing the global farmers of the Land Workers Alliance and La Via Campesina, has just come from the meetings in Glasgow. She will be speaking from London, England. Journalist Andrew Revkin will be speaking from New York, where he is founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. We'll proceed today as we do in each of these events. Each speaker will talk for 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of conversation with the other speakers. After 90 minutes, so let's begin with Joseph Hunt. Joe has worked in the fields of economic development, agriculture, environment, population, health, nutrition, and child development in Asia and Africa for nearly 30 years. He has extensive advisory and research experience on the interlinkages of food, agriculture, health, and nutrition policies and planning. Currently, he is conducting research on urban health policy in China under the auspices of Harvard University at the Center for Health and the Global Environment. So with that, Joseph, take it away.
Thank you very much, Rob, and a warm welcome to everybody. I'm calling this Restoring Biodiversity in the Climate Debate because it's been conspicuously missing for almost 30 years. James Baldwin once said in the throes of America's crisis years ago that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. And I think that accurately describes the situation we face today. Let me review a little bit of the history, which basically will point out America has not used its considerable power to effect the change that was necessary. You see on the left the copy of a dog-eared publication I've kept in my library for 30 years, published by many of the important organizations such as the World Resources Institute, the IUCN, WWF, and Conservation International, and the World Bank, which was prepared to finance an important approach to biodiversity before the Rio meeting in 1992. This was published in 1990. And every year I look at it and say, why are these issues not being addressed? Because it laid out, even then, why biodiversity was important, what are the values of biological diversity, approaches to conserving it, what needs for a database globally would be required, and the strategies and investments that would flow from that analysis. Instead, we have had a series of compromises. The biggest one that was missed was around the Kyoto Protocol, but even before then, the American president at the Rio summit argued that there shouldn't be any emissions requirements because that would inhibit American industry, particularly the fossil fuel industry. So no timetables or targets were set up initially, so there was no incentive to do anything. And so repeatedly over time, we have ignored this problem. And of course, as you know, Donald J. Trump, one of his first actions was to withdraw from the commitments around the Paris Protocol. So the way I look at it, we've had 25 years of bad COPs, and the question is, was Glasgow likely to be any different? Well, a reminder before I get off the whole emissions thing, which is, I realize, not the main purpose today, but what is quite clear is that both public and private companies are responsible for 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. And yet the fossil fuel industry has never been brought to attention or chastised in any way by any of the COP reports to date. We are now moving inexorably toward at least 3 degrees and possibly as much as 5 degrees centigrade, which would be an unlivable world. We couldn't recognize it, nor could many species survive, maybe the insects. We have very limited time, according to the IPCC, 10 to 12 years to turn this around, or the laws of physics and chemistry will realign the planet for its survival, but not necessarily for that of its life forms. This means projecting forward. And notice that all of these countries on this bar chart are from the global south, led by India, but there are 3 billion people who might be living in such extreme heat conditions that even sitting under a shady tree in the middle of the day could be life-threatening. That would be happening. That would be part of our future if we continue. What COP26 has done, or not done, is the following. Once again, chances were missed to take concerted action on global emissions and global warming. Who won and who lost? The fossil fuel industry has won again for the moment, but we'll argue too that an immense movement around farming communities, around youth, about women who are the core to environmental activism around the world, and the forgotten but critical voices of indigenous peoples need to be brought back into this conversation. And I believe that biodiversity, we would argue, is not only just an approach, but the solution. But the question is, why has it been ignored? And how can that be reversed? I will refer briefly to an important but poorly reported by the press conversation begun last year between the IPCC and the IPBES. I know that's a long name. It stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It does for the Biodiversity Convention what the IPCC does for greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of good work that's been done. And these two came together in December of last year to come up with a more integrated approach. Moving forward, if we're going to make any meaningful change around the COP process, which will be happening in Egypt next year, it must focus on biodiversity and these key stakeholders mentioned in the last line. Well, the one good news is that there is finally clarity from the IPCC. The reports in the past have kind of diddled and dithered, saying maybe there's this, maybe there's that. The last report that came out, and upon which the Glasgow meeting was faced, said it quite clearly, that basically we're in deep trouble. And unless we reverse this within the next dozen years, all we have left is about 11 years of carbon to burn, if we choose to do that, before the 1.5 degree Celsius rise since pre-industrial times will be lost, and probably 2 degrees as well. The current trajectory is toward at least 3 degrees, possibly more. The COP26 displayed no new notions of accountability or moral compass. Global emissions have risen 14% since 2010, when after the Copenhagen meeting, it was said everyone agreed to reverse this trend. And now we're saying that 45% decline of greenhouse gases is necessary to meet the target. But the one group that wasn't really too interested in this was the fossil fuels delegation, which exceeded any other, including any country delegation, over 500 people, both industry executives, industry lobbyists, and banks who finance them. And the youth, the women, and the indigenous peoples were excluded. 100,000 people demonstrated in the streets of Glasgow, marvelously expressing the diversity of the world, but at the same time, the inexorable rise of temperature will cost lives, it will cost crops, it will cost everything that we value. And unless this is reversed, the financing, I would also point out, I'm an economist, is unclear. In 2009, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, announced that the OECD countries, the rich countries, would provide $100 billion to the Global South annually for adaptation and mitigation. It hasn't happened yet. They said at Glasgow it would happen in 2023, but if it happens, I'll be happy, but I'm not holding my breath. One of the things that really mattered to the Global South was the provision for loss and damage, to look at the tremendous issues of forest fires and floods and droughts that are already damaging the developing world. No fund has been set up for that, except a nominal increase by Scotland, which hosted the meeting, which put £1 million. So at least someone has put down a thumb. But aside from that, really nobody else has stepped up, neither the governments nor the private sector. And the Global South feels betrayed. Here you see the movements, and there were supportive movements, solidarity marches in 300 locations in cities around the world. So clearly there's a movement that will not accept the past. But what's been missing at COP is the whole issue of biodiversity and ecosystem services, even though we've had the knowledge for 30 years of what we need to do. Agriculture, land ownership, land grabs around the world are a big issue. Neonicotinoids, among other insecticides used in agriculture, are killing the bees. So if we have no pollinators, we have no food. The other issues that were mentioned by Rob, such as soils and forestry. Endangered ecosystems. The peatlands control twice as much carbon as the forests do. That's been ignored. It seems to me that if COP27 is going to be more meaningful to all of us, there should be a biodiversity day put aside just to address these issues. And I'll mention briefly what that might mean in terms of water resources. First, I just wanted to remind this because I think that Dee will be talking about these issues a little bit later. A very prescient comment by Kofi Annan pointed out at an FAO conference 10 years ago that in that 1 year, enough agricultural land had been basically grabbed up by speculators to match the size of France just for a single year. And his deep concern has only been deepened as we've continued to do these sort of things. Global hunger will only increase if in fact land is taken away from the people who have a right to it. Then there's the issue of irrigation, which is highly inefficient around the world. Technically speaking, hardly any of it is used properly. I want to point out that half of the irrigation uses around the world actually mine groundwater from depleted aquifers. We've known about the depletion for at least a decade when the NASA program, a GIS program around the world that looks at meteorology and soil retention in soils, indicated that 1/3 of the aquifers are deeply stressed. A later version of this, published last year, indicates that half of the aquifers are so deeply mined, they're no longer regenerating themselves, including the Ogallala aquifer in the United States, which covers 8 states and has been responsible for the breadbasket that may no longer exist if this continues. And there are a number of water solutions well understood by the agroecology and small farmer movements around the world to which Dee will be referring. All of these techniques are well established and would in fact help to manage the water resources needed for the production of food and the sustenance of soils and land around the world. They're not carried out because agribusiness dominates the field. I would simply like to point out this is an aspect of biodiversity that isn't mentioned very much. The person here is a dear friend of mine. We did our PhDs together. He was a major director. He directed all the global programs on potato and sweet potato and led the agricultural wing of the Gates Foundation for some years. She pointed out to me that through applying science in the field, her organization was based in Peru, they were able to work with indigenous peoples in the Great Mountains and to restore to viability long lost potato varieties. And she thought about the science of it, but they said what we can do now with some of these purple and marvelous varieties now restored is tell the history of our culture to our grandchildren about their ancestors, their great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers and so forth. So unless there's culture in agriculture, all we have left is agribusiness. I think Dee will be speaking to that issue as well. Well, we see the extinction on the left of species is following the path of the growth of the human population. So we're clearly hostile to the rest of life forms on the planet. And on the right, you see that at least a fourth of all the plant and animal species are threatened with extinction in our near future. On the right, you see the bar far exceeds any expectations from history. We're clearly doing not only something wrong, but we're doing it more intensely and with wild abandon in terms of the future of our brothers and sisters in the living world. But I would like to point out this, that last December, those core issues that I talked about in 1990 finally came together through a meeting of the IPCC and the IPBES, a long name. It stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They've been doing excellent work over the years, including regional assessments through Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. So there's a database here that exists. And they came to the conclusion for the first time officially in terms of the international community that climate change and biodiversity loss must be tackled together and not separately. Andrew, I looked for this information in the standard press, but I only found it in a trade publication called Inside Climate News, so that may be of interest to you. The findings were simply this, and they were governed by an insight of Paul Lidley, a French ecologist, who said there's a real risk that biodiversity can die from 1,000 cuts. If they blunder on, as in the past, we won't solve any problems. They have to be seen as intertwined crises that have to be tackled together, both climate change and rapid decline of natural ecosystems. And the report concludes simply that positive outcomes are expected from substantially increasing intact and effectively protected areas, and also do the link to pandemics, which I'll mention a little bit later, because they are linked to biodiversity loss simply because zoonotic diseases that pass from animals to humans emerge from species that thrive when biodiversity declines. The report also was prescriptive, in leading us to conclude there are certain things we should not do and certain things that we should. Planting monocultural trees or monocultural cropping systems and substituting crops for bioenergy rather than human needs and consumption are no-nos. On the positive side, maintaining biodiversity is critical. Stop fossil fuels, stop deforestation, halt the degradation of mangroves, peatlands, savannas, and wetlands, and eliminate subsidies to big agricultural factory farms and polluting industries. Sounds like a good plan to me. The next stage was a meeting in Kunming, China. It had been planned for the previous year, but because of the quarantine from COVID, it was delayed until October of 2021, timed before the Glasgow meeting so its results could be included. It included a declaration on biodiversity, how critical it is to underpinning human and planetary well-being, that the drivers of change are the following, as mentioned before, and it calls for many countries, but the call came from many delegates, many countries. There were 94 countries represented there, for a 30 by 30 target, conserving 30% of Earth's land and sea areas by 2030. And there will be a second meeting in April and May of next year, well before the next COP in Egypt. The question is, how do we take this database and the political will that it offers us and build it from the ground up from our communities to make sure that these views are essential to any further COP discussions? Otherwise, the process will strike to me as being essentially meaningless and continue to be controlled by the fossil fuel industry. The last point I wanted to make is to discuss the role of Indigenous peoples who were pointedly ignored at Glasgow and have been for a number of years. A report from the UN says that the best protection for forests is to leave it in the hands of the people who live there. the indigenous and tribal peoples play a crucial role as guardians of about half of the forest areas in the world and 80% of the biodiversity in those forests. This is the Amazon, which has lost 270,000 square miles of rainforest since 1970. And a worrying report just came out from Yale indicating that the countries who have massive tracts of tropical forests, such as Brazil, Colombia, Congo, Indonesia, and Peru, have introduced new policies under COVID pretext to dismantle the protections for tribal communities. That must be discussed by the press and resisted. The report on Latin America that formed the foundation of this did a meta-analysis of 300 studies on the role that indigenous and tribal peoples have played as guardians of forest ecosystems, and concluded two things. There's less deforestation and less harm to biodiversity in areas protected by indigenous peoples, which they've been saying for centuries. And last, for indigenous peoples, it is a forest or a spiritual space providing food and medicine. It's a place where you build relationships, not only among people, but with the river, the water, with different species. And yet, this is what industrial agriculture is doing in the forest areas. It is responsible for 90% of global deforestation. And zoologists, this may be a conservative number, have at a minimum traced about a third of all known outbreaks, disease outbreaks, to rapid land use, including malaria. But I would argue also that the pandemics are very likely to recur if this process continues. That leaves me with one last slide, and it's more of a request that you take a look at the link to a marvelous conversation at Glasgow with two important tribal leaders from Ecuador on the left and Brazil on the right. The gentleman on the left is Domingo Peas, an Achuar leader from Ecuador, who represents 30 indigenous nations from that part of Latin America, from that part of the Amazon, who have been pushing JP Morgan Chase and others to stop financing oil and gas exploration, mining, logging, and also building new hydro dams. Their goal in this operation is summarized in this particular interview by Atosa Sultani, who is the strategy director for the Amazon Sacred Headquarters Initiative. The two of them work very closely together, and they want to develop a bioregional plan to place life at the center of economic and governance decisions. They say that protection of the biological system of the planet is the key to addressing climate change. And they're trying to protect specifically 30 million acres of pristine primary forest at the headwaters of the Amazon Valley, which they say is the foundation for protecting the lungs as well as the heart of the biosphere and our hopes for our children in the future. And yet, what came out of Glasgow was a reminder that the banking systems and governments are financing fossil fuels at the rate of $11 million per minute, which rounds to about $5.5 trillion per year. And just imagine what we could do with a fraction of that if we finally reversed direction and began to behave as one community and a rational species. I thank you very kindly for your attention, and back to you, Ron.
Andy, I see that you put a comment in the chat about Nyatero. I wonder if did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think, I wasn't in Glasgow, but I was covering it as well as I could from a distance. And my impression, particularly in the context of previous COPs, is that the Indigenous participation is finally becoming more concretized. They're significantly because organizations like Nyatero, World Resources Institute, the Ford Foundation are facilitating their having communication capacity. And also there's just been a lot of research demonstrating, there are a bunch of papers demonstrating the conservation value of having people on the ground when they're essentially working in a guardianship capacity. It's not just indigenous communities, it's also traditional local small agriculture, like in Guatemala. I did at Columbia, among other things, besides the journalism I do, I run webcast series called Sustain What, and we've done several on indigenous, both the science showing the indigenous value for conservation and conversations with indigenous community representatives in both Indonesia, Guatemala, Guyana. So I think things are changing for the better. That issue of the lack of integration of biodiversity and climate COPs and considerations is longstanding, and I share Joseph's frustrations there. A colleague at the Times did write a piece, Katrine Einhorn, whose her beat is extinction and biodiversity. When I was at the Times, my beat was the environment, which included all those things plus climate. So they now have hired many more people who are looking at these issues with more detail. So I think things are better, but maybe again, I wasn't in Glasgow. I was talking to people over there.
Well, I would just comment, Andrew, I appreciate that Ataso, the lady who speaks in this Democracy Now! Interview, says we want participation in solutions. And there was nothing of that sort. There may have been some marginal involvement, but it's not a full-scale integration of the IP perspective. And I think we would really benefit from that.
Oh, sure. Well, that's the discussion about markets. If, there's a value, if there is truly a value, and if the outside community sees literally a value in preserving biodiversity and they're willing to pay through carbon markets or the like, that you're right, that integration is not there yet. I see at least some concrete signs it's coming at the very least. It's always too late. The one thing I say about these COPs is I've seen over and over again headlines, too little, too late, but it's always too little, too late. Every one of this last 30 years is too little, too late, but that doesn't mean we're doomed.
Dee, any thoughts?
Yes, I think most Indigenous people would disagree. I think for a lot of groups, we felt that we were silenced, that we weren't able to engage in a lot of processes, even as observers. And, if it wasn't for actions within the Blue Zone or for events outside of the official COP26, I think most Indigenous people would not have had a platform. And one of the things we did arrange as part of a COP26 coalition of NGOs was a people's plenary on the Friday. And once again, Indigenous people were saying, we are not being listened to. So I think with this COP, there were a lot more NGOs, a lot more Indigenous people present, but not enough because of COVID-19 apartheid. And I know apartheid is a strong word, but it is apartheid that for a lot of people in Global South that they don't have access to vaccines, which prevented them from coming to COP26. But yeah, more people doesn't necessarily mean more engagement or more participation.
I think one of the things that's coming out of this that I'm hearing from Joseph was that there is so much actual work that was done and purposely, if not forcefully, ignored, and that is the IPBES, the ecosystem services studies and proclamations, and then the Kunming meeting in 2021. I mean, both of these seem to be putting out there in very good form, very detailed understandings of what's going on and how it can be integrated into a larger global policy. And they are simply they're being sidelined. The way Dee is saying, Indigenous people are being sidelined. So these are two streams that are somehow being sidelined. Am I getting that right, do you think?
Yes, Rob, I think you're spot on about this. And I think that the regional consultations that have occurred in the workup to these meetings, after all this dialogue between IPCC and IPBES, had 24 really well-established peer reviewers to a process of a document produced by 50 scientists. So it was quite a considerable effort. These regional assessments have pointed out the hotspots where, as Dee would know very well, the coming together of climate change, rising temperatures, extreme weather events, lack of land ownership are leading to hunger and risks of pandemics and massive deaths of people in various parts of the world. We should be using this information to see which hotspots need to be addressed most quickly and what is our response going to be technically, developmentally, financially.
Well, listen, we're right on time here. If we can, I think maybe we should move on with Dee, and we'll have more conversation when she is finished. Let me say something about her so everybody knows who she is. Dee Woods is a food and farming activist and campaigner based in London, who attended Glasgow both as an accredited delegate and in social movement spaces outside the official talks. She is the Food Justice Policy Coordinator for the Land Workers Alliance, a union of farmers, growers, foresters, and land-based workers, and a member of La Via Campesina, a global organization of 200 million peasants and small farmers worldwide. Together, the two organizations work to achieve a global vision of agroecology, food sovereignty, and sustainable forestry. So, welcome, Dee.
You'd think after almost 2 years of doing everything online that we'd be used to unmuting, but thank you for having me. Let me share my slides. And I am physically tired. I have a head cold and still trying to unpack everything. So as Land Workers Alliance and a member of La Via Campesina, we supported 14 delegates, to be able to come to COP26. Of those, we only had 3 or 4 people from Global South, from Puerto Rico, or more correctly, Boricua, and the others were from Canada and Europe. We mobilized 100 plus members of the Land Workers Alliance to participate in Glasgow and supporting us with mobilizations, with the People's Summit. So the People's Summit was organized by the COP26 coalition that I mentioned earlier, and COP26 coalition consisted of various NGOs who came together for the purpose of sort of challenging and having the alternative or the People's COP26. So we had several sessions there, including one on sort of global peasant struggles, on climate justice, reparations, climate reparations. So various topics were held. There were different days at the People's Summit. So Youth Day, disability and access, which I spoke at, because a lot of times disability is linked with access, and by access they were referring to people who couldn't access the country. And as a disabled woman myself, it is a major topic for me. We organized the farmers block on the 6th, and it was actually 150,000 people who came together on that Global Day of Action. And we had some LVC people speak at the rally after. We had at least, I would say, a minimum of 15 delegates accredited, because during the 2 weeks we were able to access several one-day accreditations at sort of relatively short notice, which enabled several more people to actually access the Blue Zone. So, all right. This is the wonderful picture on the first day of COP26. It was a queue that lasted hours. So people couldn't get in. People missed sessions. For disabled people, it was completely inaccessible. So there is a caucus, which has now become a constituency, because disabled people who represent over 1 billion people in the world do not have a voice within this. So there was some action there. And eventually, you know, we were able to negotiate proper access. I mean, one of the things that was shameful about this was the environment minister for Israel couldn't access, and she's in a wheelchair. So you'd think the global north should be able to do something about disability access, and they couldn't. I had really bad experiences as well, and it was particularly with the US pavilion. And at one session I was asked to leave, basically because I raised objections to the Aim for Climate, which is a joint venture between the US and the United Arab Emirates. And I voiced my opinion and was asked to leave, and then later on was actually refused entry, because apparently I had been marked. So I was refused entry to another session. I asked for a seat, they wouldn't give me a seat. And then witness sort of other people who weren't even stopped entering, and they had said, well, oh, the session was full, so you can't enter. And, you know, it was older white men who were allowed to enter, and myself as a Black disabled woman who wasn't allowed to enter. And that access denied, that silencing of voices seemed to be a ripple effect throughout the conference, and not just experienced by myself. And personally, you know, I think it's shameful. I have called out rather than called in the US Department on that. I haven't had a response yet, not expecting one, but it is shameful. So one way of getting my power back and our power back was staging a sanctioned action. So we are allowed to have actions. And one reasons why us as peasant farmers, agroecological farmers, representing mainly small holder farmers from the global south, had to take this action, because even within the farming constituency, we were marginalized. So the farming constituency is dominated by the world's farmers organization, and they were hosted by the National Farmers Union of the UK, and they both represent mainly industrial farmers. So for people who don't understand the difference between industrial agriculture and agroecological farming, industrial farming involves the input of chemicals, probably GMOs, gene editing, agri-tech, biotechnology, and various other inputs. And industrial agriculture only produces what, probably 25% of our food, and uses 75% of our land, and often, basically destroying forests to prepare land for monocropping. So I think 90% of deforestation that happens in the world is because of industrial agriculture. So the alternative to that is what we call agroecology. And agroecology simply means the ancestral or traditional farming methods used by cultures around the world, but it is also about people. So it is a holistic view of farming. So it is earth stewarding, land stewarding, stewarding biodiversity, and farming in harmony with nature, and putting the rights of people at the center of that farming as well. So this was our action. This picture is from the People's Plenary, where the various constituencies had a voice. As I said before, we opened with young people reading the draft declaration, and then we went on to the various constituencies making a statement. For the farmers, we wanted a global South voice, and we felt it wasn't right that we represent the farmers' constituency. Instead, we had a young Boricua woman talk about their issues with farming in Puerto Rico, and what was described as US colonialism, and the lack of infrastructure, the lack of response post-hurricane, and that the support that is needed as an island on the front lines of climate change. Here we are on the outside, holding a red piece of fabric. So apart from holding the People's Plenary, we did an action where we all walked out of COP26 holding this red piece of fabric to demonstrate this is our bottom line, that we weren't in agreement with a lot of what had been decided or had been negotiated on, and that this was our bottom line. Here we have Javier Sanchez from COAG in Spain, who's one of the older members of La Via Campesina and the European coordination of La Via Campesina, and one of our youngest members of Land Workers Alliance, and our youth articulation called Flame. For us, it is really important to uplift the voices of young people and of marginalized groups, including Black and other racialized groups, as well as LGBTQI+. So we have been building solidarity with a lot of various other organizations, not just because of COP26, but generally with our work. We've supported Indian farmers, the local Migrant Justice organizing, and first in terms of migrants, because a lot of the UK farming system is based on migrant workers, and migrant workers who basically live under slave-like conditions. You know, we see that building solidarity with migrants is important. We have what we call a hostile environment here in the UK, and with a legislation that has recently been passed, it's becoming even worse. So someone like myself can have my British citizenship revoked. So we support access and disability work as well, labor strikes, and various other, one of the other coalitions that was here during COP26 was It Takes Roots, and It Takes Roots is a collective of various NGOs who have a particular view on climate justice, and particularly looking at land justice and climate justice as reparations, and reparations in terms of loss and damage, which was actually the historical reference to loss and damage was actually removed. And so it means that for colonial or former colonial countries, it means we're now on the same playing field as anyone else, and that isn't right, because a lot of this is based on the extraction of resources by the global north from the global south, and continues to be so. So the colonialism of particularly the Americas and the Caribbean, which had that mass extraction of resources for hundreds of years, has basically, you know, created a situation where countries financially and in terms of biodiversity, right, are not prepared to mitigate or adapt to any sort of climate impacts. And it was Mia Mottley in her opening speech who made it very, very clear, right? We need a real zero and not net zero, because anything above that means death right now for a lot of countries. And within those country negotiations, you know, there were so many countries who were reiterating that, and they were still ignored. So coming back to agriculture and what's missing, food and agriculture was missing. So from the main agenda. So whilst there were quite a few side events on food, it was missing from the main agenda. And one of the disturbing things about the farming and food system sort of events and side events and meetings was that they were all centered around industrial agriculture, centered around sort of research and development, but also that they were driven by big corporations and philanthro-capitalists like Bill Gates, like Jeff Bezos, Nestle, and so many, Bayer, Cargill, you know, so many organizations who shouldn't have an influence on these negotiations, but yet were party to negotiations, unlike farmers, and particularly smallholder farmers who are at the front lines. So AIM for C, which is what I briefly introduced you before, has $40 billion invested in it and has 30 countries already signed up to it. And they are using the UN Food System Summit outcomes and action tracks to drive this, because they're saying there's increasing hunger and that, you know, this is the way we must go. And no one is looking at anything else. You know, when you have someone like Jeff Bezos putting in billions into the Congo under the guise of preserving it and conserving that biodiversity, what exactly are we signing up to? Yes, and the UK government focus on cars, coal, cash, and trees. What can I say? You know, the entire Blue Zone felt like a big fear. You know, it felt like one of these, you know, things that you go to where you're buying things. And throughout the 2 weeks, it just felt more and more like that this was about corporations maintaining their position. This was about, you know, not challenging real root causes of sort of climate crisis, but trying to protect the, you know, financial interests of companies, and that there wasn't any real interest in real solutions. So agroecology has been put forward in the Coronivia, and I don't think there's a link at the end, but the Coronivia agreement was meant to be approved at this COP, and it hasn't, mainly because, you know, agroecology is a sticking point. So the Coronivia agreement on agriculture came about in 2017, and that was meant to look at agriculture and come up with solutions. And based on the current reports, you know, agroecology is in brackets, but once again, they're driving the big agritech, biotech, gene editing, all those sort of solutions. Article 6. Right, for people on ground, people who live in communities, carbon offsetting is death. All right, it is legitimizing land grabbing for planting trees. All right, it has serious consequences for human rights, and particularly so for farmers and communities and pastoralists who are losing their land to companies and countries as well who want to plant trees. And it is something we have to look at and keep an eye on to ensure that people's rights aren't being impacted, that livelihoods and ways of lives aren't being impacted. So this was another action during COP26 on migrant justice that was held during the second week. And this is what we're thinking we need to continue doing, our political education around all these things. So, you know, global peasant-led struggles, so La Via Campesina, which has existed for 28 years, and which coined food sovereignty 25 years ago, is continuing to struggle for over 200 million people. We need to have that public education around soil carbon science and politics and those intersections. Spoke about solidarity with our migrant workers within food system. And that's not just in the UK or Europe, but throughout. I know in the US, migrant workers are a major issue in terms of conditions and pay. And, you know, what we have is a global plantation food system that basically needs to change if we are going to have people meet their right to food and other human rights, but also in terms of tackling climate crisis. You know, one of the chants was decolonize, and it was decolonize. And by decolonizing, we mean localizing your food system, ensuring that local food economies, local food systems are built first before trading, and trading equitably. So that comes back to the quote by Kofi Annan. And then seed sovereignty as a basis of that food sovereignty, and centering people who are most impacted. So another photo of us doing a workshop at one of the many events. This was one of our daily sort of debriefs and planning meetings. And here we're doing a Mystica, which is part of what we do in La Via Campesina, where everyone brings something to the space from the culture. And here we could see Paula Joya from ECVC and part of the international coordination bringing a candle made from wax from her beehives and bringing light to our struggle. And here is a quote from Jesus, who participated in our COP26 podcast, which you can find a link to on our website. And he says, all we can save, if you have never invited you to be part of the climate movement, please consider this your welcome. And if no one has ever thanked you for your efforts, please hear our gratitude. So I hope these are a series of links, and there are other things that we could add to this as things emerge. So the Food Research Collaboration did an article on food industry and in the negotiations, and they've actually broken down who has come from where, who's been party to those negotiations, who represents sort of farmers. They didn't exactly get it quite right, but very interesting article, and ask those questions about who has power and influence. And I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Well, Dee, I wonder if at some point before this whole session is over, if you could maybe put those links, if you wouldn't mind, into the chat.
Okay.
I think that these links are of great interest to people. Dee, I wanted to ask you, because it connects you with what Joseph has said. In that last one of the most recent slides, you were on workshops and discussion. You said you focused on soil carbon, science, and politics. And that makes me wonder whether how much you as an active day-by-day organizer on the ground level make use of or find useful the kind of information that Joseph was providing. For example, the enormous amount of effort that's going on in the scientific community about biodiversity and its role in here. How much can that actually drive what you are doing among people who are working the land and who are in many ways operating as a union?
I think, we do use quite a lot of that. A lot of us are working with various universities in terms of research. I'm a visiting researcher at the Center for Agroecology and Water Resilience at Coventry University, as are quite a few other people. So I think there's good science and there's bad science. It's like we need science to support agroecology and what agroecology says it can do. And, definitely in terms of biodiversity research, we've been using that to show that agroecology, improves biodiversity, can regenerate biodiversity through our various sort of regenerative and ancestral farming methods and land management methods. So definitely.
Either Andy or Joe, you have anything you wanted to ask Dee or comment?
One question I have is about the demand for real zero, not net zero, how that squares with the right and need for the informal sectors, smallholders, to participate in the financial benefits if there is funding to preserve biodiversity or climate value. In other words, how can you have it both ways? How can you say no net approach, which is basically trading, and have that integrated as well?
I think, even within the negotiations, we saw that a lot of countries compromised. And I think, it is when we do get into the room and we are able to influence, it is knowing where we can compromise. But for me, it is about supporting those global South countries who say they need net real zero rather than net zero, because in terms of one, sea levels rising, a lot of countries now no longer have fresh water, or the increase in, saline in water means that's impacting on their crops. Yeah. So, it is about bringing out all the issues and weighing up pros and cons and seeing where we can compromise. But I think, supporting farmers and pastoralists with real zero is important.
Joe, any thoughts?
Thank you very much for this very riveting presentation, and still maintaining the vision, the progressive vision that you have. I think the important thing that should be coming out is that the agroecology, the Via Campesina and land justice movements are forces to cool the planet. They're reducing the risk of temperature rises that we're all terrified of.
There you go.
Everything about what you do in terms of land ownership and justice, using polycultures to increase biomass, all this is dampening the impact of climate change. And of course, the powers that be don't want to hear that, but there should be a solidarity between all of that that you represent so beautifully, and the broader progressive movements of youth, women activists, and the indigenous peoples. I'd like to see that develop further, and thank you for your contribution.
Great. We're going to move on. Thank you very much, Dee. And that's our kind of ground level report of Glasgow up close. Let me now introduce you to Andrew Revkin, our final speaker. Andrew is a journalist who has written on climate change for more than 30 years, mostly for the New York Times. He is the founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. He has written acclaimed books on the history of humanity's relationship with weather, the changing Arctic, global warming, and the assault on the Amazon rainforest, as well as 3 book chapters on science communication. Andrew, go ahead.
It's really a pleasure to be in this session. And those comments you made about the difficulties, physical, structural, and the like, in having the full scope of human endeavor integrated into these discussions was incredibly important and moving, and shows you how many limitations there are still in this world that are sort of path dependent. In other words, we have these big structures, we have big economies, it creates these barriers that, what you were saying about COVID, COVID apartheid is so true. I spent much of the first year of the pandemic running webcasts about the pandemic and about what they revealed about the care economy, for example, and how if we don't have a care economy, if we're not valuing the full structured economies, including informal work, we're going to still have pandemics going forward, and we still haven't figured that out. Climate, what you were talking about in terms of land use, the dominance of smallholder farms as a big source of the basic sustenance of much of the world's population doesn't get enough value because it's not measured in the conventional ways that these big sessions measure. The FAO focuses on commodities, and that feeds into how these, if there is a discussion of food at the COP sessions, it's about the things that we know, not the things that are immeasurable. Those challenges they transcend the climate talks. The one thing in covering this for so long, I think, I can't remember if I showed it earlier, I'll show it now. So this in 1988, June of 1988 was when Jim Hansen testified in front of the Senate and said, global warming is evident in the data. I started writing about it. So this story predates the COP process. It predates the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I've had the pleasure and sort of nightmarish responsibility of digging in on this issue since then. And one thing I've learned about the emerging diplomacy, I chose not to go to this COP because among other things, I was really upset with how the COVID pandemic was going to make it so poorly representing the world's peoples, the ones that have the greatest energy needs and the greatest impacts. And I found actually logistically it's easier to cover them by not being there. I can talk to everybody via the internet. But the thing I've learned about this process, and it took until Copenhagen, so 2009, almost 20 years into the process or is that more than 20 years, from 1992, for the world to realize that you can't get 196 countries to sign a contractual targets and timetables style agreement. That these sessions basically memorialize more than shape what people, countries, institutions do. So it's good news and bad news. It means there's not a lot that gets done in those rooms that isn't already going to happen because countries decided regionally, nationally, they're going to pursue some initiative, or they feel safe that they can commit to it in those rooms because they know that they can measure it and demonstrate. And that doesn't mean it's not worth going. It doesn't mean that the time you put in being there isn't vitally important. And it certainly in terms of the informal sessions and making the case to the world, it is a platform. So it's worth being there to make that case publicly, but it's not really the thing that will shape what happens in those rooms going forward. What does shape those things is stuff that's already happened in countries or in sectors of society. And so when I wrote a piece about this COP in my new blog. I call it a blog, others call it a newsletter. There were some encouraging signs, but none of them were determined there. They weren't determined there. They weren't determined in Madrid or in Copenhagen. They're determined on the ground, some through innovation, some through increased visibility, some through the better capacity to track issues like methane emissions with technology. It's that we have a growing capacity to do some of the things that need to be done. Maybe I'll just show a couple of things. I think I can show my screen. They're not slides. What I'm showing you right now is the website of If Not Us, Then Who. It's an Indigenous communications network. It's Indigenous peoples from Indonesia, the Amazon, Central America, South Asia, and everywhere where people are facing challenges, whether it's related to land loss, to corporate, institutions, whether it's related to climate impacts. And it's facilitated by the Ford Foundation and other donors. And it's the kind of thing that creates a cross-check and a voice for these groups that will never be adequately represented in the rooms or in these institutions that are like the COP process, but that can shape the national and local conversation. There's a news operation that's got a similar architecture, Mongabay, mongabay.org, which is now a global news operation similar to this network of indigenous communicators. And what they've been doing is this fantastic array of coverage of biodiversity and climate issues and indigenous challenges in the languages of the Amazon and languages of Southeast Asia. There's even in Nepal and the Himalayas, there's a Third Pole is a publication that has a granular focus on the same issues in that region in the relevant languages, and also connects to the global communication landscape. So you have the New York Times can find a story more easily or find sources by looking at these other more local voices. That wasn't there 10 years ago. Well, actually, Mongabay started, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, but we're moving into a world now where there's so much more capacity to identify swiftly issues on the ground. A great case study was in Indonesia, maybe 6 or so years ago. The security force around a pulp and paper operation killed a local peasant who was there protesting, and that news was out in about 2 hours. And when I wrote my book about the murder of Chico Mendes in the Amazon rainforest in 1988, the preceding decades were decades of invisible slaughter, where you never would have that sensory apparatus that allows these issues to promulgate and get swift response. It doesn't always change things, but it is changing things in ways that are really remarkable. Another thing that came up at the COP that I find encouraging was, and this is where you mentioned science earlier, Dee. There has to be a lot of science historically was done kind of like journalism historically was done. As a journalist, the New York Times would send me or to the Arctic, or would send their Rio bureau chief to the Amazon and to tell a story. And now it's flipped. What needs to happen more is for the Times and other institutions to facilitate voices emerging and telling their own stories. And that's happening slowly more and more. Science, the same thing. There are now satellite technologies that were announced at COP26 that were not the result of the climate process at all. They were the result of, I mean, the diplomacy process. They're the basic advances in technology of now you can trap not just where there is forest and is not forest, which is the old satellite images, really pretty crude. Now there's a forest biomass monitor project that's just been launched that tells you the quality, how much carbon is there, what kinds of trees they are. You know, this gets to that question of whether it's that you're putting in plantation forestry or not. You can have a much more precise way to evaluate conditions. And if, again, you know, if there ends up being some flow of finance to local communities and or indigenous communities for the work that they're doing, it's satellite imagery helps to make the case. I'm sure some of you have seen the most famous example of this, I think, is the Xingu Reserve in the Amazon, where you see the global map, or the map of the Amazon, you see all the fires and smoke, and there's this area that doesn't have any of that. And it doesn't have any of that because it's this Indian territory that's now clearly, demonstrably making a change. So those things, so it's like, what can you do with media, with technology to facilitate the sustenance of the capacities on the ground that are both improving people's lives day to day, giving them more reliable market for their goods. What can the finance world do? You know, it's not going away. We live in a world with a huge trillions of dollars global economy. Supply chain transparency is something that can make a big difference for, like, local coffee producers, maintaining their fair share of the income that's generated when someone drinks a cup of coffee in Manhattan. There's more capacity to do that through these various technologies and communication possibilities today than there would have been 10 years ago. So I'm kind of trying to keep track of these things on that scale, and I find some promise. I'm just going to show you a couple more things that I'm trying to do and that are relevant. What was said about biodiversity not being integrated with climate discussions was as true. Yeah, this is 2014. I was, you know, at the UN, and literally at the UN there were two different summits, one on biodiversity and one on climate, and one on population, and they weren't talking to each other. And the idea that you could have a discussion about climate change and not have the population question be part of it is just felt to me insane. So I was writing about that at the time. But that's still this form of journal. You know, it was a blog that I did at the New York Times along with my conventional writing, but it's still kind of me telling you stuff. And at Columbia University, I've moved to a different format where this is a very relevant session we did recently during what's called Climate Week, which was thanks to the miracle of technology, again, global connectedness. We had people from several key places around the world talking about, this is when that, was it Dee or Joseph who mentioned the that food summit that just happened? I think that was in September.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right around then, you know, there were issues there about representation too. It was mostly big ag. So we held some discussions. I started doing these webcasts during the pandemic, and now it's a big chunk of what I do to communicate is to get people together from a distance to look at what we can do a little bit better each time on these issues like food and resilience. Here's another one: strengthening the rights of forest guardians can reduce future pandemic risk. It was also about land loss and the like. So to me, that's where I direct more and more of my time. The future of media, I think, to me, we miss that. Telling a better story is very far from actually generating a solution. You know, someone has to embrace the story, share the story, and do the work. By fostering better conversations as opposed to writing better stories, I think I'm helping to build a model for getting disciplines to talk to each other who don't talk to each other, or disciplines like farmers and remote sensing folks, or these sessions have been involved indigenous communities, done one with people in the Arctic about their issues. So that's, yeah. So again, if not us, then who? They did have a presentation. I don't know, Dee, if you ran into some of those folks there, but it's less the cops. The thing about the cops that matters is the communication that can happen around them, like these initiatives, but the actions that will change outcomes at the cops are back home. I think that's something that I feel pretty strongly about. So I'm going to stop there because I'd rather engage more in the conversation than in more presentation.
Great, thank you. This really suggests a lot of threads that can be brought together here. Let me just throw this out first to Joe and to Dee. Would you have any particular comments right at this moment? Do you want to respond to Andrew?
Yeah, so really agree with you. That work happens at home, on ground, on the outside, but there is that increasing co-option of democratic spaces from the top down, which is why, as sort of organizations and movements, we have to get involved. So like with the UN Food System Summit, right, which didn't come from parties, it came from the former General Secretary and the World Economics Forum. So, there's no legitimacy in that. And yet within the CFS, it is being forced on the CFS to promote that and to action it. So we have to be involved on different levels in influencing policy and change. And I think we need to be more involved as farmers, as food system, and we're all involved in food system because we eat at the COPs. We need food systems and agriculture high up on the agenda.
I agree.
Yeah. I'm going to start.
Could I add something for a minute?
Yeah, go ahead.
I thought it was terrific, Andrew, to talk about the evolution, your own personal evolution, but also the evolving space in journalism for inclusive dialogue, and not only in formal ways, but a really genuine attempt to say, well, it's no longer top down, talk down journalism. I'm the expert, I'll tell you what to believe, but rather everyone has evidence that can contribute to a broader, more enriched conversation. Dee's presentation reminded me, as I said, of, hey, the things that small farmers are doing cool the planet. There's plenty of evidence that if you look at extreme weather events, the yield decline that happens in industrial agriculture is 20 to 30% lower than in traditional small farms that are more based upon polyculture and sustaining biomass. So those kinds of insights should be coming to the larger community. So my question for you is this: we have clarity on the IPCC saying we have to change now or we're going to lose control of the situation. And from the IPBES working with IPCC, we know what to do in terms of biodiversity. We can update the Biodiversity Convention, we have the data. Now the question is, can the role of the press be altered to change the nature of the dialogue at COP27 and when ones beyond that, so that it's truly an inclusive information space? I'd really like to know what you think of that question.
I guess the basic answer is no. But let me take this back a notch. This gets to, keeping these processes in perspective, there's still a sense that science says, therefore we do. And unfortunately, COVID, everything, we live in a world that unfortunately hasn't worked that way. And I don't count on it transforming quickly, which circles me back to a different way to frame things. If one failure with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, profound one, is it's all shaped around climate change and not around climate risk. And I wish, thinking back, I wish if I could have changed one thing, even my own writing, that my cover story wasn't about global warming, meaning the phenomenon of CO2 driving to climate change, but was on climate risk. And when you do that, it really changes everything. Because you say, well, what is at risk or who is at risk? What is driving the risk? And then you realize it's an imbalance in power more than this mechanistic sense that there's going to be some top-down magical, the UN or God, someone will tell us something in a way that will make us change all of our behaviors. But when you focus on risk, the justice issues goes right to the top. We don't live in a world of even vulnerability. And whether it's, and then you think, okay, which crops are at risk? Well, okay, let's work on that. Who is feeding whom? Measuring, as was said earlier, if we just had a way of measuring who is well fed and how has that happened? And if it's mostly smallholders, then why is the world not helping smallholders as much? The biodiversity treaty, the New York Times can write 10 more page one stories saying that Ed Wilson now feels half the earth should be conserved. I think it's a great idea. But it always comes back to which half and what do you do to save it? And that always comes back to not the global culture or it's what happens in a meeting hall in some conference center. It comes back to what's the culture in Indonesia? What makes people care about forests in Indonesia? The people who are going to be cutting them down or allowing that to happen. And what's the same thing for Canada and for Ecuador. So it's kind of like, which is sort of like what we're saying. Actually, the Biodiversity Treaty, it doesn't really have the common but differentiated contributions component, right?
No, it doesn't.
Well, that's the one key in innovation in Paris was the nationally determined contributions. If we don't have countries looking at their landscapes and the rich world saying, well, what can we invest in to reduce deforestation or conserve reefs or the like, then we can have all these more precise descriptions of what's going to be lost, and it's not going to really change anything. So it has to be the stuff on the ground. So that, I guess, don't count on the media or even a more precise report on biodiversity loss or climate change really doing enough unless we're really looking at what does that change the landscapes on the ground? What's at risk? What are the drivers of risk? I mean, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, that's enough.
Andy, I was just, because I've attended a number of Society for Ethnic Music for environmental journalists, and I hear their concerns in the chat and what people, and is a prevailing problem that they all seem to feel, and that is, well, we've got to tell a very complicated story. We've got to explain the science. And I'm wondering what in light of your idea of me telling you type of story, what do you feel about this problem of translating the science as a journalistic problem? And you as a mediator of this material, how do you look at that?
Well, I think there a lot of my friends, I'm part of SEJ too, I are still captured by the idea that our product is a story. In fact, there's a really interesting NYU professor of journalism, Jay Rosen, who wrote a really great piece a number of years ago. He said, why is it that journalists came up with the idea that the story is the thing that's their product? It's like, that's the factory, that's the sausage that comes out of our factory is story.
That's their commodity, isn't it?
Yeah, as opposed to what's the problem we see in a community of fire vulnerability in California? What can we do with our resources as an institution, a news medium, to facilitate progress on the ground? And it might be a mapping tool. The Los Angeles Times nearly got a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago for creating a sea level game. So it allows any coastal community in California to kind of look at sea level in the context of their topography. And that to me is the frontier that excites me, as opposed to writing another, I've written 3,000 stories, at least 2/3 of which are on climate change. And I just don't see that as driving things. A last thing, funders can make a difference. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation 5 years ago wanted to foster a better conversation between climate scientists and Arctic indigenous communities. And they dangled money in Columbia, a group at Columbia, with the Inupiat community in Kotzebue, a village on the Chukchi Sea, got together and just started kind of talking to each other about their capacities and their issues. And they've just been producing a bunch of papers where the village representatives are co-authors. And it's using climate science to understand the variability in sea ice that is a danger to the population as they go out hunting for seals. And they're still learning climate science too, but it's a co-generation of research, not just co-production of, it's not just scientists going to a community and holding a town hall and saying, we are here to study climate change. It's a very different process, but that's still an outlier.
It's a great model. That's a terrific model.
Yeah, and I ran a session on that, and it really excites me to think about how to propagate that. But the key thing there too, to think about, is the design came from the Moore Foundation. Most funding, most grants are like to do X, and to do X by year X, and what are the outcomes that are measurable, as opposed to, here's some money to build a relationship between climate science and social science and a community at risk. Go at it. Let us know how you're doing. What can we do with that?
Jeez.
I know, it excites me a lot, that kind of thing.
Listen, for you, Andy, but also for either Dee or Joe, there's a question that's very telling here that Brian Cartwright has brought up from the chat. Could we address whether issues like ecosystem and land restoration can directly cool and stabilize climate? I feel that too often we fall into the prevailing assumption that everything depends on getting all the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But both need to happen, and this message gets totally drowned out. I was wondering what your thinking was on that, Andrew, and then anybody else wants to comment on it.
Well, just briefly, no, I think this gets at the point I was making earlier about vulnerability. If you reframe stories around risk and opportunity, stories or projects, you get this landscape of possibilities emerges right away. This is really, it's not just agriculture and land use, but flood vulnerability. I just wrote a piece about the infrastructure deal, $1 trillion+ And the piece, I'll post it in a minute, or you can just search for it on my main website. Basically, I was saying there's all this talk about build back better, but actually, in many cases, hopefully that money will be used to unbuild back better, to move concrete away from rivers, to give them more of dynamic capacity to be a river. Think about that in context of green infrastructure, and much of which can also have a value for agriculture or aquaculture and the like. There's just, but again, that takes breaking our norms. Build back better, I've never liked. It should be build forward better.
Unbuild, I like the unbuild part.
Oh yeah, so anyway, I just think that's all doable. Even Yonkers, New York, they did this project I wrote about 10 years ago. It's called daylighting, where you take a river that was buried through a pipe. The Sawmill River goes under Yonkers, and now it's exposed, and now it's part of an ecosystem again. So that's the example of unbuilding back better. Same thing for agriculture.
Dee, you have any questions or anything to say to a journalist here? Since you're somebody who's going to have to be talking with getting to the larger world. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts to add to this discussion about journalism.
I really like your work, Andrew, and how you're amplifying voices. And I think probably my question would be, how can we spread your work and your questioning, you know, to other journalists?
Well, let's talk. Obviously, I'd like to write more about what you're working on. I did, everything I said about storytelling.
Yeah.
The stories still matter. They matter a lot. So I'd like to hear more about your story and help propagate that too. In terms of spreading it to others, I do think social media help a lot. We hear about the downside of social media all the time. It's terrible. It's been a destructive force these last several years because it's designed to do that. It's a terribly broken system. The algorithms are taking us to the worst parts of ourselves. But whether it's on Twitter particularly, I think is a medium where you can still make a lot of progress. A lot of journalists are on Twitter. So, demonstrating best case examples there can propagate pretty rapidly through the journalist community, and activists too, are making this more about conversations and then propagating stuff, both stuff that doesn't work, so people don't have to repeat the drill, and things that are working, so you can say, oh wow, we could do that in our community too. That's where the best of social media can really make a difference.
I think we're into our general Q&A part time now. We've already started to field some questions. There's a question here for Dee.
Would you mind, Rob, would you mind if I
No, please go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question, it's a very important one, is that the agroecology community, with the support of La Via Campesina and hopefully other partners, is in fact cooling the planet. I didn't put it in for lack of time, but there's a haunting photograph of biomass disappearance around the world. If you look at Africa and large parts of Asia, also parts in the Amazon region, the biomass concentration, which looks at species richness as well, both flora and fauna, has declined about 30% in the last 25 years. What this means is they're going to become irremediable hot zones. They will develop mature droughts that will challenge food security around the world. And that suggests that we will have pockets of unlivability that are growing year by year unless we reverse this process. As Dee said, industrial agriculture uses 3/4 of the land and produces 25% of the food. Unless we reverse that in ways that are meaningful. And I would think that journalism plays an enormous role in this. At Glasgow, they read the names of 1,000 environmental activists who have been murdered since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, 1/3 of whom are Indigenous persons. And Indigenous persons represent about 1% of the global population. The people on the firing lines need support. And from Colombia, which had the largest number of murdered individuals in that 1,000 person group, they said, we don't view these persons as dead. They are our ancestors and they are our future children and grandchildren, because they will not be dead because they're part of a community that believes in life, in all life forms. I would think that that's a marvelous, poignant metaphor for where we are, and the journalism could take that, because it's an open question what that means and how to develop it together as solution. And I think you could do marvelous investigative reporting, not least finding out why the IPBES data was completely ignored in Glasgow. Once again, we have clarity on the problems, but we need to involve everyone in looking for the solutions. Just a thought.
There's another question here. It's sort of it's related to messaging, but very prominent people are involved here. And And the question has to do with whether anybody can we reach Greta, and we all know who Greta is, to get her to include the drawdown or eco restoration or regenerative architecture in what she says. So far, she seems to be focused on just emissions, and that's a question from Philip Bogdanov. I'm just wondering, this is a messaging related question, but it also relates to the actual core of what the problems are. Anybody have any thoughts about that one?
Dee, I don't know if you have thoughts, but
yeah, I mean, there are so many young climate activists who existed before Greta, who have platforms and, you know, who do have this message. And it is about a movement and not having this focus on one person, because I think we risk this sort of Hollywood stardom sort of, yeah, focus on one person and not necessarily getting the messages across. So I think it is about building solidarity with those activists who are within those movements and who are experiencing these things firsthand to, you know, amplify those messages.
Exactly. And I think Greta is pretty immovably focused on industrial emissions and not really the land. That's her story, is turn off the smokestacks and not really these other issues.
And I mean, yeah, and I mean, there was a brilliant young Kenyan activist who was there, who was speaking to all these things. Yeah.
And Shia Bastida is a young a Mexican Chilean indigenous representative who's at University of Pennsylvania. I've met her several times, and as you were saying, amplifying the voices of these folks is a better path forward, I think, ultimately.
Listen, does any of you have any, actually, this is a question that somebody asked you, Dee, and I was hoping you could say it out loud, and that was the question of whether at the COP at any point did the question of debt forgiveness come up as a feature of all of these plans, you know, particularly for the population of people that you are dealing with here?
Wherever it came up, it was shut down. So I know, for instance, Nicaragua, which is mainly an economy based on farming, I think, you know, 70%, they came with an ask for climate reparations in terms of, which included that debt forgiveness, and it was shut down immediately. All right, no one is entertaining any sort of historical loss and damage or anything around debt cancellation. All right, in fact, even a lot of the climate finance that has been agreed will be in form of loans rather than grants. That says it all.
Of course. Somebody's got to make a dollar in it. Karen Merriam asks, anyone know more about Modi's recent repeal of the controversial farm laws in India? Is this a true win for farmers, or are there other plans afoot? In other words, this is in response to the huge demonstrations by farmers against these recently created farm laws in India. And I'm just wondering, do any of you know that? Joe, do you know anything about this? Be more specific.
A little bit, yes. What Modi attempted to do by passing a law on Friday evening so that no one could even cover it, press couldn't even cover it, went through the Lok Sabha in Delhi, was to eliminate all the social safety nets associated with the production of food and the distribution of adequate nutrition through food subsidy programs to India's poor. The vast majority of Indians still live in rural areas. So rather than and what it did is it broke open any concept, fragmented any concept of a circular economy within which production, trade and distribution, and the deep involvement of women, particularly in high value, high nutrition crops in homesteads, that was all broken. And so it's destroyed even the areas of India that are known as its breadbaskets, like the Punjab. It's been the Punjab farmers, the Sikhs, who have been leading these demonstrations. So this is at least a recognition that privatizing the economy will simply lead to mass famine, to greater concentration of land holdings, which, how does that work in the rest of the world? Not too good, huh? And so we now have a pause, but the question is there a secret agenda? We'll have to wait and see, because the GMO community is very alive in India and influenced by the global agribusiness community. So we should support our colleagues as best we can to retain efficiency in production, but also efficiency in water use, because India is going through a massive water crisis that is being exacerbated by the kind of programs that have not worked out very well in the past.
There is another question Libby Comeau asks, regarding deforestation and what effective limits there are to it. And he's asking whether it's people's culture or the legal structure that we should look to as to how to stop deforestation. On the one hand, the people's culture, there's a sense of sort of shrugging, who cares about what the people think, and the legal structure, which is tied up in what is allowable. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the deforestation issue. You talk about agroecology, and you have talked with forestry members of your group. Dee, I'm wondering whether this legal versus people forces. How do you see that? Because this is actually a policy issue.
It needs to be both. You know, we need to have people on ground actually implementing and, you know, developing proper land use strategies, you know, with agroforestry, with sort of regenerative sort of models, and not just rewilded. And it needs to happen. We need to have that policy to enable that. So getting agroecology into various bits of legislation, if not with agroecology, at least sort of the other language around it, but it needs to happen both ways.
Absolutely. And the other element, you know, we think of technology mostly in the context of industry, but again, remote sensing technologies and communication technology are key to creating the ecosystem you need, the sort of information ecosystem that links the legal outcomes with people on the ground. There's also an organization, tiny little effort called TIMBY, T-I-M-B-Y. I think it's timby.org. That's allowed people to demarcate their own activities, to identify whether it's in Liberia or elsewhere. I think Liberia, one of their early case studies, document in a way that can be used in court, illegal deforestation and the like. So it's an ecosystem approach. At Columbia, the law school has a climate law center that's trying to facilitate renewable energy. You know, it'd be interesting for me to talk to them about this idea of facilitating the legal structures that can help integrate with the local and regenerative and traditional land use folks.
Robert, both Andrew and Dee have pointed out the importance of bottom-up ground movements in our own countries to take responsibility for trends we deplore. I would like to introduce the concept of dietary diversification, which is within our control as human beings. I think of two things that are driving the deforestation economics more than anything else. One is the conversion of perfectly fine primary forests into the monocultures of various kinds of oils, including palm oil especially, which happens to be very poor for your diet because it has a lot of fatty acids in it. And I know in Sri Lanka and other places which used to have diversification of forestry and don't anymore, the rates of vitamin A deficiency have increased because the beta-carotene being lost in traditional shrubbery is lost to everyone. And it may not sound like a very important thing, but it leads to blindness in mothers and children. And it's a very high risk factor for mortality of children from infectious diseases. So there's been a loss in health, loss in nutrition. And the other thing that's driving it is the factory farms. I mean, China ceased to produce soybeans for its own animals about 15 years ago. They used to be self-sufficient. And that's driving much of the deforestation in the pampas of Argentina and the Amazon River Basin itself. So if we get together a sense that we can alter diets, and Harvard, and among others, has done a really good amplification of the Mediterranean diet to show how that would save lives and save quality of life, even in our industrialized nations, we have something. But again, as Andrew said before, how do we bring this information to bear upon decision-making and action, concrete action? That's the great challenge.
Well, this brings me to what I think is going to be our final question here. It was from Hayat Imam. She's saying that we have good tools already. We've got the IPBES report, the Kunming Conference Declaration, the Amazon Bioregional Plan. We've got the People's COP26 declarations. The question is, could we put together any kind of local committee to support or publicize and move forward these concrete steps? So this is a sort of, after this what? Where is the possibility of mobilization using this already enormous accumulation? And Andrew, I'm going to add to that a very good point that I keep forgetting, and that is you have mentioned how these certain technological tools now put in our hands for communication and for registering of problems in the soil, for example, on the water. We have these tools. So now how can this focus on a concrete policy moves that are motivated from the ground up? Mm-hmm. Anybody have any thoughts?
We just need to build on our movement of movements and building that solidarity. I know within the food sovereignty movement, agroecological movement, it's not just farmers and pastoralists. We have fishers, we have academics. We do have increasingly sort of media people. So like, for instance, a growing culture, which seeks to amplify the voices of sort of people within the agroecological movement, but we need to amplify it a bit more. We can't just depend on one or two organizations, and we need to be getting our hands dirty within the policy world. I'm not an academic, and I've literally dived head on into the policy world, coming from the local and city region right up now to the global. So anyone can do it. Anyone could get involved.
That's quite an endorsement.
And I'll just say, the last thing is everyone I think on this call probably has felt a sense of despair or paralysis at some point, or fatigue. I know Dee has felt fatigue, knowing what it's like running around those halls. But finding a way to sustain your own sense of engagement toward outcomes is exactly through what Dee was talking about, meaning building a community of communities, a movement of movements, sharing and shaping ideas, testing things. And it comes with compromises. There are people who are sort of carbon hawks, I'll call them, as opposed to climate hawks, who are so dug in on emission reduction that they might support some of the biomass solutions to cutting carbon, which are just going to impede food production, especially, in an industrial landscape. So finding a way to compromise sometimes for the sake of the grand goal is important. And then just your own personal sustainability, just being able to wake up in the morning, have a conversation like this one, take 1 or 2 nuggets from it and share them with someone else, push it forward just a little bit. And knowing that, you know, that there can be upside surprises too. I think the IPCC report in 2018 was identifying a downside, outcome that feels pretty, it can make you paralytic, but there's lots of potential in social structures and human capacities, especially amplified by the upside of social media, that can really make a difference, I think.
Joe, final word?
Well, I don't want to end on a difficult note, but I do worry that the world is becoming more famine prone than it was before. Perhaps I'm biased by my experience in my 20s when I was in India and in Nigeria during actual famines. Those conditions have to be reversed, and they can be buffered by all of the good insights we've discussed today. We just need to generalize and move the debate to the human condition. And it's nothing short of that. We have a decade to get that organized, and we should start with the COP27. And I appreciate this opportunity to join you today. Thank you.
Well, that's quite a note to leave on. I want to leave it as a final notice to everybody that in January, the next edition of this series will focus, we'll have also another representative from Via Campesina, Chuki Nanjunaswamy from India. And we're going to be guaranteed that there's going to be some continuity with what we've been saying today. The thread through this is all about regeneration, about those possibilities using the biology that is now we've been learning so much in the hands of Indigenous people, and that is responsible for producing more than 70% of the world's food. This is a place to start, and not to be distracted by other kinds of techno solutions and easy fixes. So I want to thank all of our speakers today, Andrew Revkin, Joseph Hunt, and Dee Woods for your incredible contributions here today. And you've created just the kind of lively conversation that we think is necessary here. Now, Dee, it's time to go home and take a rest. Okay, we all want you to kick back a little bit for a minute. It's all going to make us feel a little bit better. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but let's look forward to hearing the notice that the recording of this event when it is made available in about a week or two, and you will be hearing from us about the next date in more toward the end of January, when we will do another edition of this. Thanks to everybody.